Caleb Warren had 30 days to find a wife or lose everything. The land soaked in his sweat, the ranch built with his scarred hands, the only proof he'd ever mattered. When Eliza Moore stepped off the stagecoach in Iron Creek, Arizona, the townswomen whispered spinster like a curse, but Caleb saw something else. A solution wrapped in calico and quiet defiance. She wasn't looking for rescue. He wasn't offering love. Just a bargain struck in desperation beneath the brutal desert sun. Neither expected the agreement to cost them everything they'd hidden. Neither imagined it might save them both. Before we begin this journey across the Arizona territory, I invite you to stay until the very end of this story. If it moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Caleb and Eliza's story travels. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The lawyer's office smelled of dust and old paper, but what filled Caleb Warren's nostrils was the stench of injustice. He stood before Thomas Ridley's mahogany desk, his hat crushed between calloused hands, every muscle in his body coiled tight as fence wire about to snap. 30 days. Ridley didn't look up from the document. The territorial statute is clear, Mr. Warren. Homestead claims require proof of permanent settlement, a family. The land office has decided that a single man living alone doesn't meet that standard. I've worked that land for 6 years. Caleb's voice came out low, dangerous. Built every fence post, dug every well, lost 2 fingers to frostbite the first winter, and nearly died of fever the second. You're telling me that doesn't count as permanent? Ridley finally met his eyes, and Caleb saw something worse than cruelty there: indifference. I'm telling you what the law says. Marry and establish a household, or the claim reverts to the territory for reassignment. 30 days, Mr. Warren. The clock started yesterday. Outside, Iron Creek's main street baked under the late August sun. Caleb stood on the wooden sidewalk, his world tilting on an axis he couldn't control. 6 years. He'd left Missouri with nothing but pride and fury, determined to carve something from the wilderness that no man could take from him. The Arizona territory promised land to those strong enough to hold it. He'd been strong enough. But apparently, strength wasn't sufficient. Tough break, Warren. Caleb turned to find Samuel Porter leaning against the hitching post, tobacco staining his smile brown. Porter owned the land east of Caleb's claim, owned it through inheritance and marriage, not labor. He'd been circling Caleb's property like a vulture for 2 years, offering to take it off your hands whenever drought or rustlers hit hard. 30 days isn't much time to find a wife, Porter continued, especially for a man with your reputation. Caleb's reputation. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward to encompass every reason the decent women of Iron Creek crossed the street when they saw him coming. He was too quiet, too scarred, too rough, too alone. The kind of man mothers warned daughters about. Not because he was dangerous to women, but because he was dangerous to the social order they'd imported from the East. He didn't attend church, didn't make small talk, didn't pretend the territory was anything but what it was: brutal, beautiful, and indifferent to human comfort. I'll manage, Caleb said. Porter's laugh followed him down the street. Sure you will, and if you don't, I'll give you a fair price, out of Christian charity. Caleb kept walking. His gelding waited at the far end of town, patient as the rock formations that jutted from the desert floor. He swung into the saddle, his body moving through familiar motions while his mind churned through impossible calculations. 30 days. In 30 days, he needed to find a woman willing to marry a stranger, move to a remote ranch, and tie her fate to his for the sake of a legal technicality. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours. The land unfolded around him in shades of copper and gold, creosote and sage stretching toward mountains that seemed close enough to touch, but remained forever distant. His ranch sat in a valley where a spring-fed creek, Iron Creek, named for the rust-colored minerals in the water, provided year-round water. The house was small but solid, built from adobe and timber he'd hauled himself. The barn was newer, larger, built after the first good cattle sale. It wasn't much, but it was his. He unsaddled the gelding and turned him into the corral, then stood looking at the house as if seeing it through a stranger's eyes, a woman's eyes. The place was functional, nothing more. No curtains, no garden. The furniture consisted of a table, 2 chairs, a bed, and a wood stove. He'd never needed more, but a wife would. A wife would need what? Comfort? Beauty? Things he'd stripped from his life like dead weight? Hell! The word fell flat in the evening air. He spent the next week in a state of controlled rage, working from dawn until his body forced him to stop. He mended fence until his hands bled, cut firewood until his shoulders screamed, rode fence line checking for rustlers until exhaustion made him sway in the saddle. Physical pain was clean, simple, unlike the problem that waited for him each night when he finally stopped moving. On the 8th day, he rode back to Iron Creek. The town had grown since his first visit 6 years ago. A church now, a proper general store, even a schoolhouse. Signs of civilization creeping across the territory like morning glory vines, pretty and choking. The post office occupied a corner of the general store. Caleb had never had reason to visit it before. He had no one to write to and no one who'd write to him. But he'd heard things. Rumors of services back east that matched lonely men with women willing to travel west. The postmaster, a thin man named Fletcher, with spectacles that magnified his eyes to unsettling proportions, looked up when Caleb entered. "Help you?" "I need—" Caleb stopped. The words stuck in his throat like burrs. "I heard there are agencies, for men looking for wives." Fletcher's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind those magnified eyes. Judgment, maybe. Or pity. Caleb couldn't tell which would be worse. "Mail-order bride services," Fletcher said. "Sure. There are a few. Most reputable is the Waverly Agency out of Boston. They charge a fee, require references, conduct interviews. Takes time, though, usually 3 to 6 months to make a match." "I don't have 6 months. I have 3 weeks. Now Fletcher's eyebrows rose. "That's ambitious. The Waverly Agency won't work on that timeline. There are faster services, but they're less selective. More risk for both parties." "What kind of risk?" "The kind where you pay the fee and get a telegram saying your bride changed her mind, boarded a different train, or never existed in the first place." Fletcher pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Or where a woman arrives expecting one situation and finds something entirely different, leads to trouble." Caleb had lived with trouble for 6 years. One more variety didn't scare him. "Give me the names of the fast services." Fletcher wrote out 3 addresses, his pen scratching across paper with fussy precision. "You'll need to send a telegraph, not a letter. Include your basic details and requirements. If you're lucky, you'll get responses within a week. If you're very lucky, one of them will actually show up." Caleb paid for the telegraphs and dictated his message, feeling Fletcher's judgment with every word. "Rancher, Arizona Territory, seeks wife for legal homestead claim. Must arrive within 21 days. Room, board, and fair treatment guaranteed. No romance expected. Reply Iron Creek, Arizona." The words sounded cold even to his own ears. But what was he supposed to say? That he was looking for partnership, companionship, love? Those would be lies. He was looking for a solution, a woman willing to trade her name for security, however modest. Fletcher sent the telegraphs without comment. Caleb paid the fees, more money than he liked spending on uncertainty, and walked back into the afternoon heat. Now came the waiting. He rode back to the ranch and threw himself into preparation, trying not to think about what he was doing. The house needed work if a woman was going to live in it. He built a second bed frame and installed it in the small room he'd been using for storage, moving his tools and tack into the barn. He whitewashed the adobe walls. He fixed the leak in the roof he'd been ignoring for 2 months. The work was good. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from circling the same bitter thoughts, that he was buying a wife like livestock. That desperation had driven him to this, that he'd spent 6 years building independence only to have it threatened by a law designed to force men into the very domestic arrangements he'd fled Missouri to escape. He'd left Missouri because of a woman. Sarah Hendricks, with her yellow hair and promises. She'd said she loved him, loved his plans to head west, loved the adventure of it, right until her father offered her to Daniel Pritchard, who owned a store and a house, and the kind of future that included Sunday dinners and social standing. Sarah had chosen Pritchard without a backward glance, and Caleb had learned that love was just another word for conditional acceptance. He'd sworn then he'd never need anyone again. He'd build his life alone, dependent on no one's whims but his own. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. 13 days after sending the telegraphs, a reply arrived. Fletcher sent word via a ranch hand who was heading past Caleb's property, and Caleb rode to town the next morning with his stomach tight. 2 responses waited. The first was from a woman in Philadelphia who'd changed her mind after learning the details of his location. The second was from the Waverly Agency itself. "We have a candidate who may suit your unusual time frame," the telegram read. Eliza Moore, age 32, Boston, educated, unmarried, seeking Western placement for personal reasons, willing to travel immediately upon agreement, references available. Reply if interested. 32. Caleb was 34 himself, old enough to know better than to believe in fresh starts, but apparently not old enough to avoid needing one. He sent the confirmation that afternoon. 3 days later, another telegram arrived with travel details. Eliza Moore would arrive in Iron Creek on September 18th on the afternoon stage. That gave her exactly 10 days to make the journey and gave Caleb exactly 2 days after her arrival to marry her before his deadline expired. No time for second thoughts, for either of them. The morning of September 18th dawned clear and hot. Caleb woke before sunrise, as always, and worked through his chores with mechanical efficiency. He fed the horses, checked the cattle in the near pasture, repaired a section of fence that didn't really need repairing. Anything to keep moving. At noon, he rode to town. The stage was due at 3 o'clock, assuming it ran on schedule, which it rarely did. He could have waited at the ranch, could have sent word for her to be brought out to him. But something, pride maybe, or courtesy, or simple curiosity, made him want to be there when she arrived. He waited outside the stage office, his back against the wall, his hat pulled low against the sun. The town moved around him. Women in their neat dresses, shopping for supplies and trading gossip. Men conducting business with handshakes and tobacco-stained smiles. Children running between buildings, their laughter sharp in the dry air. Normal life. The kind he'd never wanted and now needed to simulate. The stage rolled in at 3:30, its wheels kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a veil. The driver hauled on the brake, and the horses stamped and snorted, glad to stop. 2 passengers disembarked, a salesman Caleb recognized from previous trips, and a woman. She wasn't what he'd expected. Caleb had imagined someone worn down by life, desperate enough to accept a stranger's proposal from 2,000 miles away. Someone who'd look at the Arizona territory and see her last option. Eliza Moore looked at the Arizona territory like she was evaluating a piece of furniture for purchase. She was tall, taller than most of the women in Iron Creek, and built with solid substance, not the delicate slenderness fashion magazines supposedly preferred. Her traveling dress was dark blue, practical, dusty from the journey. Her face was angular, strong-featured, not pretty in any conventional sense, but arresting in its intelligence. And her eyes, gray as winter sky, missed nothing as they swept across the town, the people, and finally landed on Caleb. She knew him immediately. He didn't know how. They'd never exchanged photographs, and his telegram had included no description, but recognition sparked in her gaze. She picked up her own carpet bag, waved away the driver's half-hearted offer of help, and walked directly toward him. "Mr. Warren." It wasn't a question. "Miss Moore." He touched his hat brim. "Was the journey difficult?" "It was long." She set down her bag and studied him with that same evaluating gaze. "You're younger than I expected." "You're taller." The corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to humor. "I've been told I'm an inconvenient size. Too much of everything and not enough of what matters." "What matters?" "Apparently, delicacy, deference, the ability to fade into wallpaper when men are conducting business." Now she did smile, and it transformed her face from merely striking to something close to handsome. "I've never mastered any of those skills. Thus, Boston's loss and Arizona's gain." Caleb picked up her bag. It was heavy. Books, he guessed, from the weight distribution. "I should tell you the situation clearly. The marriage is a legal necessity. I need a wife to keep my land claim. You'll have your own room, your own space. I'm offering partnership in the ranch work and fair treatment. I'm not offering romance or affection." "Good." The word was crisp. "I've had quite enough of romance and affection. Both tend to come with conditions I'm unwilling to meet. They stood looking at each other in the dusty street, two strangers about to tie their lives together for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. "There's a preacher," Caleb said. "We could marry today if you're willing, or you could take time, see the ranch. There's a boarding house if you want a night to reconsider." Eliza glanced around Iron Creek, taking in the false-fronted buildings, the rutted streets, the mountains rising in the distance. "I didn't travel 2,000 miles to reconsider. I came to start over, Mr. Warren. If you're offering that opportunity, I'll take it. Today is as good as tomorrow." "You're certain?" "I'm certain I want control of my own future. If marrying you gives me that, then I'm certain enough." Caleb nodded slowly. She was practical, honest, two qualities he valued more than beauty or charm. "The preacher's name is Dalton. He'll want payment and a witness. We can find both easily enough." "Then let's find them." They were married an hour later in the church that smelled of new pine and old hypocrisy. Reverend Dalton performed the ceremony with barely concealed disapproval. His questions about their spiritual preparation met with silence that he eventually accepted. The witness was Fletcher from the post office, who watched the proceedings with those magnified eyes and probably logged every detail for future gossip. "Do you, Caleb Warren, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Eliza Moore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife." No kiss, no celebration, just a piece of paper that Caleb folded into his pocket with the care of a man handling dynamite. Legal proof. 30 days and he'd succeeded. The ranch was safe. So why did it feel like he'd just traded one trap for another? They collected Eliza's trunk from the stage office, larger than the carpet bag, filled with more books and practical clothing, and loaded it into the wagon Caleb had brought. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. 2 hours of silence broken only by the creak of wheels and the occasional comment about landmarks. "That's Porter's ranch," Caleb said, pointing to a sprawling complex of buildings. "He owns everything east to the ridgeline." "Everything?" Eliza studied the landscape with focused attention. "Inheritance from his wife's father. He's been trying to buy my land for 2 years. Offers less every time." "Because he knows you're desperate." "Was desperate," Caleb corrected. "Not anymore." Eliza turned to look at him, and he felt the weight of her intelligence like pressure against his skin. "We're both desperate, Mr. Warren. Let's not pretend otherwise. The question is whether we're desperate enough to make this work." The ranch appeared as they crested the last rise. Small buildings against vast emptiness, human structures dwarfed by the indifferent landscape. Caleb watched Eliza's face as she took it in, looking for disappointment or regret. He saw only calculation. "The house," he said, pointing. "Adobe and timber. Stays cool in summer, holds heat in winter. The barn. Corral. That low building is the smokehouse. The creek runs year-round, even in drought. The pasture supports about 200 head of cattle." "How many do you have currently?" 140. Lost some to rustlers last winter." "Rustlers?" She said the word like she was tasting it. "That's common here?" "Common enough. Law's scarce. Men take what they think they can get away with." "And do they? Get away with it?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not if I catch them." They reached the house as the sun touched the mountains, painting everything in shades of copper and blood. Caleb helped Eliza down from the wagon. Her hand was strong, her grip sure, and carried her trunk inside. The house was exactly as he'd left it. Clean, sparse, utterly devoid of anything soft or welcoming. He watched Eliza examine the space, her gray eyes taking inventory of the whitewashed walls, the scarred table, the iron stove, the 2 doors leading to the 2 bedrooms. "It's not much," he said. "It's honest." She ran her hand along the table, testing for stability. "No false promises, no illusions. I appreciate that, Mr. Warren." "You can call me Caleb. We're married, after all." "Then you should call me Eliza." She turned to face him, backlit by the dying sun through the window. "I'd like to establish some understandings, Caleb, if we're to make this arrangement work." "All right. First, I expect honesty. If something isn't working, I want to know. I can't fix problems I'm not aware of. Fair enough. Second, I expect my work to be valued. I'm not decorative. I'm useful. I can cook, keep books, manage a household, work cattle if needed. I grew up on a farm before my family moved to Boston. I haven't forgotten how. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Hope, maybe, or relief. I can use the help. Third, and here her voice grew harder, I expect my privacy to be respected. You said separate rooms. I'm holding you to that. I didn't come west to trade one kind of unwanted intimacy for another. The words landed like a slap, unexpected and sharp. Caleb felt his face heat. I'm a lot of things, Eliza, but I'm not a man who forces his attention where it's not wanted. Your room is your space. I won't enter without invitation. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then we understand each other. We do. Good. She picked up her carpet bag. Which room is mine? He showed her the smaller bedroom, watched her take in the new bed frame, the whitewashed walls, the single window facing east. She set down her bag and turned to him with an expression he couldn't read. Thank you, she said, for preparing this. I know it wasn't necessary. It was necessary, Caleb said. You're my wife. You deserve a decent place to sleep. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or reassessment. I'll unpack and then start dinner, if that's acceptable. You don't have to. I'd like to. I've been eating stage-stop food for 4 days. I'd like to cook something real. Caleb left her to settle in and went to tend the animals, grateful for the familiar routine of feeding and watering, checking hooves and counting heads. The work settled his mind, gave him something to focus on besides the fact that there was now a woman in his house. His wife. A stranger who'd somehow agreed to tie her future to his based on a telegram and desperation. When he returned to the house, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hit him like a blessing. Eliza had found his stores, limited as they were, and was cooking with the efficiency of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times. She'd removed her traveling jacket and rolled up her sleeves, and he could see the strength in her forearms as she worked. Supplies are low, she said without turning around. When do you usually go to town? Once a month. I went 2 weeks ago. Then we're due. I'll make a list of what's needed. Do you have credit at the general store? Some. I have money of my own. She flipped the bacon. From my father's estate. Not much, but enough to contribute to household expenses. Caleb felt that shift again, that sensation of the ground beneath him changing texture. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. This is my household too now, isn't it? Yes. Then let me contribute to it. She plated the bacon and eggs, set them on the table with a directness that left no room for argument. Sit, eat, then we'll discuss what tomorrow looks like. They ate in silence. The food was good. Better than good. Caleb hadn't realized how much he'd been surviving on rather than eating until he tasted seasoning applied with care, eggs cooked just right instead of scorched. When he finished, Eliza poured coffee and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her cup. Tell me about the ranch, she said. Everything. I need to understand what I'm part of now. So he told her. About the 6 years of building, the struggles with drought and rustlers, the careful management of limited resources, about porters circling pressure, the territorial politics, the isolation that came with being hours from the nearest neighbor. He found himself talking more than he had in months, maybe years, the words coming easier in the face of her focused attention. She listened without interrupting, her questions precise when they came. How many acres? Water rights status? Cattle breed? Market access? She asked about things he'd never discussed with anyone because there'd been no one to discuss them with. You've built something solid, she said finally, against significant obstacles. That takes strength. Or stubbornness. The line between the two is thinner than people think. She stood, began clearing plates. I'll need a few days to learn the systems here, where things are kept, what the routines are. After that, I can take over the household management completely. That should free you for the ranch work. You don't have to eat. Stop saying that. She turned to face him, hands on hips. I didn't come here to be a burden or a decoration. I came here to work. Let me. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it. He'd spent 6 years alone, making every decision, managing every detail. The thought of sharing that burden was foreign, uncomfortable, and unexpectedly appealing. All right, he said. Thank you. The next days fell into a rhythm neither of them named, but both seemed to understand. Caleb worked the ranch, mending fence, checking cattle, patrolling for rustlers. Eliza worked the house and began learning the systems that kept the ranch functioning. She found his account books and went through them with the eye of someone who understood numbers, pointing out discrepancies and suggesting reorganizations. You've been paying too much for feed, she said on the third evening, the books spread between them on the table. The supplier in Iron Creek is charging 20% above market rate. He's the only supplier in town. Then we'll order from Tucson. Even with shipping, we'll save money. Caleb studied her across the lamplight. You know about market rates for cattle feed? I know about markets. My father was a farmer before he became a merchant. I learned to read account books before I learned to read novels. She made a notation in the margin. You're also undercharging for your beef. Porter's paying you $5 less per head than he's selling for in Prescott. How do you know what Porter's selling for? I asked the butcher in Iron Creek when we went for supplies. She looked up, gray eyes steady. Information is power, Caleb. If you don't know what your work is worth, someone will profit from your ignorance. He felt something settle in his chest. Respect, maybe, or recognition. You're good at this. I'm good at seeing systems and finding inefficiencies. It's why I was never good at being a proper Boston lady. I kept pointing out problems that weren't considered appropriate for women to notice. Like what? She smiled, sharp as a knife. Like how the charities my mother's circle supported somehow spent 60% of donations on administrative costs. Or how the bank my uncle managed was lending money to businesses he had silent stakes in. Or how the man I was supposed to marry had 3 mistresses and debts that would have destroyed us both. Caleb sat back. That's why you left. Part of why. The fuller answer is that I was 32, unmarried, considered a lost cause by polite society, and facing the prospect of living on my brother's charity for the rest of my life. She closed the account book with finality. I chose to write my own future instead, even if that future is in the middle of Arizona with a man I've known for 3 days. Any regrets? Ask me in a year. But her eyes held something that might have been humor. So far, the account books alone are more interesting than anything I've done in the past 5 years. They worked in comfortable silence after that, Eliza reorganizing his records while Caleb cleaned his rifle and tried not to think about how natural this felt. How easy it was to share space with someone who didn't demand conversation or affection, who simply worked alongside him. It was dangerous, that ease. It made him forget they were strangers bound by contract, not choice. On the 5th day, trouble arrived in the form of Samuel Porter. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the rider approach. He stepped into the sunlight, rifle in hand, and felt his jaw tighten when he recognized Porter's sorrel mare. The man rode into the yard with the confidence of someone who owned the world and was simply waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. Warren. Porter touched his hat brim, his eyes already scanning for changes. They landed on the laundry hanging on the line Eliza had strung between 2 posts. Women's clothing, undeniable proof. Heard you got yourself married. Thought I'd come see if the rumors were true. They're true? Mind if I meet the new Mrs. Warren? Caleb minded very much, but before he could say so, Eliza emerged from the house. She'd been baking bread. He could smell it from here, and she had flour on her apron and strength in her bearing. Mrs. Warren, Porter said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Samuel Porter. I own the neighboring ranch. Welcome to the territory. Mr. Porter. Eliza didn't smile back. Thank you. Quite a change for you, I imagine. Coming all the way from... He let it hang. Fishing. Boston. Boston. My. That's a long way to come for a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Must be quite a love story. It's a marriage, Eliza said flatly. That's sufficient. Porter's smile thinned. He turned back to Caleb. Speaking of marriage, I suppose this means you've met the territorial requirements? Kept your claim? It does. Congratulations, then. Though I have to say, Warren, I'm surprised you didn't take my offer. Would have saved you the trouble of importing a wife just to satisfy a legal technicality. Caleb felt his grip tighten on the rifle. My wife isn't a legal technicality. Of course not. Of course not. Porter's eyes traveled between them, calculating. Well, I'm sure you'll both be very happy. Though I should mention, as a neighbor and in the spirit of friendly advice, that ranching is hard work, especially for someone not accustomed to frontier life. If it doesn't work out, Warren, my offer still stands. Fair price for your land and cattle. We won't be selling. We? Porter's eyebrows rose. How modern? Well, the offer's there if you change your mind, either of you. He tipped his hat to Eliza. Ma'am, I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. He rode off, and Caleb stood watching until horse and rider disappeared over the ridge. When he turned back, Eliza was still standing on the porch, her expression thoughtful. He wants your land, she said. He wants everyone's land. Porter measures his worth in acres. No, Eliza shook her head. He wants your land specifically, the way he looked at this place. That wasn't general ambition, that was specific desire. Caleb climbed the porch steps, stood beside her looking out at the ranch he'd built. The creek, this is the best water in the region. With my land, he could control access for miles. Then we need to make sure he never gets it. That word again, we. Caleb looked at his wife of 5 days, this stranger who'd reorganized his books and identified his enemies and stood on his porch like she had every right to be there. Yes, he said, we do. That night, Eliza asked to see the property boundaries. They stood in the doorway as twilight turned the desert purple, and Caleb traced the lines with his finger against the darkening horizon. The creek runs through the center, he said. My northern boundary is that rock formation. See where it catches the last light? South runs to the old cottonwood grove. East and west are marked by survey stones, but they're hard to spot unless you know where to look. How much of Porter's land borders yours? All of the eastern side, near 3 miles of shared boundary. Eliza was quiet for a moment, her eyes tracking the landscape with that same evaluating gaze she'd used on his account books. In Boston, my father had a saying about men like Porter. He called them land-hungry, said they couldn't see a piece of earth without imagining it as theirs, no matter who'd worked it or bled for it. Your father sounds like he knew men. He knew enough to die in debt to them. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cooling air. The bank took our farm. The polite version is that he made poor investments. The true version is that men like your Mr. Porter orchestrated those poor investments, then profited when everything collapsed. Caleb heard the bitterness beneath her words, recognized it because he carried his own. Is that why you left Boston? The debt? The debt. The scandal. The marriage proposal that was really a business transaction designed to absorb what little my father left behind. She turned to look at him, her face half shadow in the dying light. My brother wanted me to accept it, said I was being selfish, that family duty required sacrifice. But I'd watched my mother sacrifice herself to duty until there was nothing left but a grave marker. I decided I'd rather risk the frontier than repeat her mistakes. So you answered my telegram. I answered several. Yours was the most honest. No promises of romance or comfort. Just a clear transaction, partnership for security. I appreciated that you didn't dress it up as something it wasn't. Caleb felt something uncomfortable move through his chest. Guilt, maybe. Because if he was honest with himself, he'd thought of her exactly that way, as a transaction, a legal solution. He hadn't considered that she might be running from her own ruins, making her own desperate calculation. I'm sorry, he said, about your father, about the men who destroyed him. Don't be sorry, be successful. That's the better revenge. She smiled, and in the near dark it looked almost fierce. Now show me how to shoot that rifle. If Porter's circling, I want to know how to make him reconsider. Over the next week, Eliza proved herself as relentless in learning the ranch as she'd been in organizing the accounts. She woke before dawn, worked past dusk, and approached every task with the focused intensity of someone who decided that failure wasn't optional. Caleb taught her to shoot, and she practiced until her shoulder bruised from the rifle's kick. He showed her how to read cattle sign, track movement patterns, spot sick animals before they infected the herd. She absorbed it all with that sharp intelligence, asking questions that made him reconsider things he'd been doing by habit. "Why do you water the cattle at the north end of the creek?" she asked one morning, watching him open the gate to the pasture. "Always have." "But the south end is closer to the barn. We're walking them an extra half-mile twice a day." Caleb opened his mouth to defend the routine, then stopped. She was right. He'd started using the north watering spot 6 years ago because it was farthest from Porter's land, a small act of defiance. But it made no practical sense now. "You're right," he said. "We'll switch them to the south spot tomorrow." Eliza nodded, already moving on to the next observation. "The fence posts along the eastern boundary are weathering faster than the others. Different wood?" "Same wood, more exposure to Porter's land." He didn't elaborate, but she caught the implication immediately. "You think someone's been tampering with them?" "I think the fence gets tested more on that side than anywhere else." Her jaw tightened. "Then we reinforce it." They spent 2 days replacing posts and adding extra wire to the eastern fence line. It was hard work made harder by the October heat that refused to acknowledge autumn. Eliza worked beside him without complaint, her hands blistering and then callousing, her back straight despite the strain. She didn't ask for breaks or special consideration, and Caleb found himself matching her pace, then pushing harder because she made it impossible to do less. On the second evening, as they rode back to the ranch with the sun bleeding red across the horizon, she suddenly reined in her horse. "There." She pointed toward a distant rise. "Did you see that?" Caleb followed her gaze but saw nothing except creosote and rock. "See what?" "Movement. Near that outcropping, like someone was watching, then pulled back when I looked." He studied the landscape with sharper focus now, his hand moving to the rifle in its saddle scabbard. The territory was full of reasons for men to watch ranches: rustlers scouting for opportunity, drifters looking for work or trouble, travelers navigating by landmarks. But something about Eliza's certainty made his instincts prickle. "Could have been an animal," he said. "Deer, maybe." "Maybe," but she didn't sound convinced. That night, Caleb took his bedroll into the barn instead of sleeping in the house. When Eliza noticed, she came out to the barn door, silhouetted against the lamplight from within. "What are you doing?" "Keeping watch. If someone's scouting the place, I want to know about it." "You think I really saw something?" "I think you're not the kind of woman who imagines threats." He settled against a hay bale, rifle across his knees. "Go sleep. I'll wake you if anything happens." She hesitated, and in that pause he saw her weighing trust against self-reliance, partnership against independence. Finally she nodded. "Wake me in 4 hours. We'll split the watch." "Eliza." 4 hours, Caleb. I meant what I said about partnership. That includes standing guard." She was right, and arguing would be pointless. 4 hours. Nothing happened that night, or the next. But 3 nights later, Caleb woke to the sound of cattle moving wrong. Too fast, too scattered. He was out of the barn and mounted before his mind fully caught up to his instincts, racing toward the northwest pasture where he kept the breeding stock. He found them scattered across a quarter-mile, panicked and running. And he found evidence of what had scared them. Fresh tracks from multiple horses, a broken fence section, and 5 missing head, including his best bull. Rustlers. By the time he'd settled the remaining cattle and assessed the damage, dawn was breaking, and Eliza was in the yard, dressed and waiting with his spare rifle. "How many?" she asked. 5 head, the bull and 4 heifers." "When?" 3, maybe 4 hours ago. Tracks head northeast." She moved toward her horse, her face set with cold anger. "Then we go northeast." "We don't do anything. I go. You stay here and keep watch." "Absolutely not." Caleb felt frustration spike through his exhaustion. "This isn't about you proving something, Eliza. These are dangerous men. If I catch up to them, then you'll need backup." She swung into her saddle with the ease of someone who'd been doing it all her life. "I told you I grew up on a farm, Caleb." That included dealing with thieves who thought a widowed woman and her children were easy targets. "I know how to shoot, and I know how to keep my head. Now stop wasting time and let's find your cattle." He wanted to argue, wanted to order her back to the house where she'd be safe, but the set of her jaw and the steadiness in her eyes told him arguing would accomplish nothing except delay. "You do exactly what I say." he said. If I tell you to run, you run. Understand? If you tell me to run, we both run. I didn't survive 32 years to die protecting cattle. She met his eyes. But I didn't come west to hide while someone steals from us either. Now let's go. They tracked northeast for 3 hours, following the clear trail of 5 cattle being driven hard. The rustlers weren't bothering to hide their path. They were moving fast, probably planning to reach Porter's land before Caleb could catch them. Once across that boundary, the cattle would disappear into Porter's herd, and proving theft would become a legal nightmare. But the rustlers had made one mistake. They'd underestimated how quickly Caleb would notice and how hard he'd pursue. He spotted them near mid-morning, driving the cattle through a narrow canyon that would funnel them toward Porter's eastern boundary. 4 men, well armed, moving with the confidence of people who'd done this before. There, Caleb said quietly, reining in behind a rock formation that gave them cover. 4 riders. The cattle are in the canyon, Eliza finished. If we circle around to the north side, we can cut them off before they reach the exit. Caleb looked at her. You've done this before. I told you, thieves don't care if a farm is run by women, and women learn to fight back or lose everything. She checked her rifle with practiced efficiency. What's the plan? The plan was risky, maybe stupid, but it was the only option that didn't involve letting 5 head of cattle, worth nearly $300, disappear into Porter's herd. They split up, Caleb circling to approach from the north while Eliza positioned herself on the southern ridge with a clear sight line down into the canyon. He gave her 20 minutes to get into position, then rode into the canyon mouth with his rifle ready. The lead rustler saw him and immediately went for his gun. Caleb fired once, deliberately high, the shot echoing off canyon walls like thunder. Next one's lower, he called out. Leave the cattle and ride out. Only warning you get. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men laughed, a sound full of contempt and confidence. You're one man, Warren. There's 4 of us. Do the math. Actually, Eliza's voice rang out from the ridge, clear and cold. There's 2 of us. And my rifle is pointed at your friend with the red shirt. If anyone reaches for their gun, he dies first. The man in the red shirt went very still. Caleb felt something dangerous and warm move through his chest. Pride, maybe. Or partnership recognized. My wife makes a good point. Now let's try this again. Leave the cattle, ride out. We won't follow. Porter's not going to like this, the lead rustler said. Then Porter can discuss it with me directly. These are my cattle on my land. You're stealing. The law's pretty clear on what happens to cattle thieves. The law was actually murky at best, and non-existent at worst in this part of the territory, but the threat carried weight, especially with Eliza's rifle still trained on the man in red. The rustlers exchanged glances, a silent conversation about odds and risks and whether 5 head of cattle were worth dying for. Finally, the leader spat into the dust. This ain't over, Warren. It is for today. Caleb kept his rifle steady. Ride. They rode, leaving the cattle milling in confusion in the canyon. Caleb waited until they were out of sight before signaling Eliza to come down. She descended from the ridge with her rifle still ready, her eyes tracking the horizon for threats. You all right? He asked. Fine. You? Fine. He looked at her, this woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago as a solution to a legal problem and had just held 4 armed men at gunpoint without her hand shaking. That was necessary, she interrupted, and effective. Now let's get these cattle home before they decide to come back with reinforcements. They drove the cattle back to the ranch, a slow process made slower by the animals' agitation. By the time they reached the barn, the sun was setting and both of them were exhausted. Caleb unsaddled both horses while Eliza checked each animal for injuries. The bull's got a rope burn, she called out. Not serious, but I should treat it. Medicines in the barn, left side, second shelf. He finished with the horses and found her in the pen with the bull, applying salve to the raw patch on its neck with steady hands. The animal stood still for her, calmer than it usually was even for Caleb. You have a way with them, he said. I have patience with them. There's a difference. She wiped her hands on a rag, studied the bull's eyes for signs of distress. He'll be fine. They all will. Thanks to you. She looked up at him then, her face smudged with dust and her hair escaping its pins. Thanks to both of us. That's how partnership works, isn't it? Partnership. The word had meant something theoretical when they'd married, a legal arrangement, a practical division of labor. But standing in the corral with the evidence of their shared risk all around them, it meant something different, something real. Yes, Caleb said. That's how it works. That night they ate a late dinner in tired silence. Eliza had made stew earlier in the day, and Caleb heated it while she washed the dust from her face and hands. They sat across from each other with lamplight between them, two people who'd started as strangers and were becoming something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. Porter's behind it, Eliza said finally, breaking the silence. The rustling. It wasn't random. Probably. Definitely. Those men knew exactly where your breeding stock was kept. They knew the fence was weakest on the eastern side, and they were driving the cattle directly toward Porter's boundary. She set down her spoon with a quiet click. He's testing you, seeing what you'll tolerate. Caleb had reached the same conclusion, but hearing her say it made it more real, more dangerous. He's testing us. Then we need to show him the test results. She met his eyes across the table. I've been thinking about the account books, about the patterns in your sales and Porter's purchases. What kind of patterns? The kind that suggest he's been manipulating the market to drive down your prices. He buys when you're desperate, after a bad season, after rustlers hit you, after any setback. And he pays just enough to keep you afloat, but not enough to thrive. Caleb felt anger kindle in his gut. He'd suspected something similar, but had never had the time or knowledge to prove it. You can demonstrate this? With the records you have and the information I gathered in town? Yes. It won't hold up in any court. There's no court to hold it up in. But it'll give us leverage. Proof that Porter's not just a neighbor. He's an active threat. What do we do with that leverage? Eliza smiled, and it wasn't a gentle expression. We stop playing by his rules. We find new buyers for your beef. We document every instance of trespassing and theft. We make it clear that Iron Creek Ranch isn't easy pickings anymore. She paused. And we consider finding allies, other ranchers who've dealt with Porter's pressure, build a network. It was a good plan, a smart plan, the kind of strategic thinking Caleb had never applied because he'd been too focused on survival to think 3 moves ahead, but it also required something he'd avoided for 6 years. Connection. Trust. Opening his world to other people. I know a few ranchers, he said slowly, north of here. We've traded work during Roundup. Never talked about much beyond cattle and weather. Talk to them about Porter. See if they've had similar problems. If they have, see if they're willing to coordinate. Strength in numbers. And if they're not interested, then we handle it ourselves, like we did today. She stood, began clearing plates. We're not helpless, Caleb, and we're not alone anymore. That changes the mathematics significantly. Over the following weeks, that mathematics proved itself in ways both large and small. Eliza's reorganization of the ranch systems freed Caleb to do work he'd been putting off for months. Together, they repaired the irrigation ditches that fed the kitchen garden, rebuilt the smokehouse door, inventoried and organized the tack room. The work went faster with 2 sets of hands, but more than that, it went better with her eye for efficiency and his knowledge of what worked in the harsh territory. They developed rhythms. Eliza handled the cooking and household accounts while Caleb managed the daily cattle work. But the boundaries blurred easily. She rode fence line with him when an extra pair of eyes was needed, and he helped her plant a winter garden when she pointed out they were spending too much on vegetables they could grow themselves. They didn't discuss the blurring, didn't name what was happening. They simply worked. In early November, Caleb rode north to visit the Johansen Ranch. Eric Johansen was a Norwegian immigrant who'd claimed land at the same time as Caleb, and over the years they'd developed a cautious friendship based on mutual respect and occasional cooperation. If anyone would be willing to talk honestly about Porter, it would be Eric. He found the other rancher mending fence in the cold morning air, his breath steaming as he worked. Caleb Warren. Eric straightened, surprise clear on his weathered face. Don't usually see you this far north? Trouble? Questions? You have time to talk? They talked over coffee in Eric's small cabin, and Caleb learned that Porter's pressure extended well beyond Iron Creek Ranch. Eric had lost cattle to rustlers twice in the past year. His southern neighbor had sold out to Porter after a mysterious fire destroyed his barn. A widow to the east had been offered pennies for her late husband's claim and had taken the offer rather than face another winter alone. He's consolidating, Eric said grimly. Slow but steady, and there's not much we can do about it. Law's a week away and doesn't care much about range disputes. What if we coordinated? Shared information about rustlers, backed each other up when Porter makes moves. Eric studied him over the rim of his cup. That'd take organization, trust. Most of us out here prefer keeping to ourselves. Most of us out here are getting picked off one at a time because we keep to ourselves, Caleb countered. Porter counts on that, on us being too independent to band together. You're talking about forming a cattlemen's association. That's politics, Warren. You hate politics. I hate losing my ranch more. Caleb set down his cup. I'm not asking for anything complicated. Just agreement to share information and provide backup when needed. Strength in numbers. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Finally, he nodded. I'll talk to the others, see who's interested. But Warren, this kind of thing, it requires leadership, someone to coordinate. You volunteering? Caleb thought about Eliza, about her strategic mind and her understanding of how men like Porter operated. My wife has experience with this kind of organizing, back east. Eric's eyebrows rose. Heard you got married, fast courtship. Fast necessity, but she's proven herself capable. Then bring her to the next gathering. We'll hear what she has to say. Caleb rode home feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grabbing at debris, but the solid hope of someone building a foundation. When he reached the ranch, he found Eliza in the barn, examining one of the horses that had seemed off that morning. Stone bruise, she said, straightening. Not serious, but he should rest for a few days. Eric Johansson wants to meet you, Caleb said. She turned, surprise flickering across her face. Why? Because I told him about your idea for coordinating the ranchers. He wants to hear more. For a moment, Eliza just looked at him, and he couldn't read the expression in her gray eyes. Then she smiled, small but genuine. When? 2 weeks. There's a gathering in Iron Creek for the autumn cattle auction. Eric will spread the word to the other ranchers. We can meet after. Then I'll prepare. She moved past him toward the house, already planning. We'll need documentation, evidence of patterns, a clear proposal for cooperation. Caleb watched her go, this woman who'd arrived as a legal solution and had become something far more complicated, something essential. Partnership, she'd called it. But standing in the barn with the November wind bringing the smell of coming winter, Caleb wondered if the word was big enough to contain what was growing between them, and whether he was ready for whatever came next. The 2 weeks before the gathering passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Eliza spent her evenings compiling evidence from Caleb's records and her own observations, building a case that was equal parts numbers and narrative. She worked by lamplight long after Caleb had gone to check the animals one final time, her pen scratching across paper with focused intensity. One night, Caleb came back to the house to find her surrounded by ledgers and maps, her hair loose around her shoulders and exhaustion shadowing her eyes. You should rest, he said. I should finish. But she set down her pen and rubbed her temples. If we're going to convince these ranchers to trust each other, I need to show them exactly what they're up against. Vague warnings won't be enough. Caleb poured coffee, set a cup beside her elbow. What have you found? A pattern of acquisition that's been building for 5 years. Porter started small, buying out struggling homesteads, offering just enough money to make desperate people feel grateful. Then he began creating the desperation, rustling that targets specific ranches, market manipulation that drives down prices right before he makes offers, strategic fires and accidents that look natural but cluster around properties he later acquires. She tapped one of the maps where she'd marked former homesteads now part of Porter's holdings. 18 properties in 5 years, Caleb, and every single acquisition followed some kind of crisis. The scope of it settled over Caleb like cold water. He'd known Porter was ambitious, ruthless even, but this was systematic predation. Can you prove it? Not in any court, but I can show the pattern clearly enough that any rancher with sense will see the threat. She looked up at him, her gray eyes steady despite her fatigue. The question is whether they'll act on it. Men don't like being told they're vulnerable, especially men out here who've staked everything on their strength and independence. You think they won't listen because you're a woman. I think they won't want to listen because I'm a woman pointing out their weakness. There's a difference. She smiled without humor. I've spent my entire adult life watching men ignore good advice because it came from the wrong source. I'm prepared for resistance. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Then we present it together. You have the evidence and strategy. I have their respect, limited as it is. Between us, maybe we can make them hear. Something shifted in her expression, a softening he rarely saw. You trust my analysis. I've seen your work. You're smarter about this than I am, than most of them are. Of course I trust it. That's not the same as trusting me. The words hung between them, weighted with meanings Caleb wasn't sure how to navigate. They'd been married nearly 2 months, worked side by side through rustlers and repairs, shared space and silence and the occasional conversation that went deeper than cattle counts. But trust was different from cooperation. Trust meant vulnerability, exposure, risk. I'm learning to, he said finally. Trust doesn't come easy to me. No. Eliza's gaze didn't waver. I imagine it doesn't. Just like it doesn't come easy to me. We're both people who've been given good reasons not to trust. And yet here we are. Here we are. She gathered her papers with careful precision, building something together, whether we meant to or not. The gathering in Iron Creek drew more ranchers than Caleb expected. Eric had spread the word well, and curiosity, if nothing else, brought men from claims as far as 20 miles away. They met in the back room of the saloon after the cattle auction, 15 weathered faces studying Caleb and Eliza with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. Eric made the introductions, his Norwegian accent thickening with formality. Most of you know Caleb Warren. This is his wife, Eliza. They've got something to share about Porter's operations. I suggest we listen. Caleb let Eliza take the lead. She stood at the head of the table with her maps and ledgers, and when she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Gentlemen, I've spent the past 2 months analyzing land acquisitions in this territory. What I've found is a systematic pattern of consolidation centered on Samuel Porter. She unfolded the map, her finger tracing the marked properties. In the past 5 years, Porter has acquired 18 homesteads. Every acquisition was preceded by a crisis that made the owner desperate to sell. That's ranching, one of the men interrupted. A burly rancher named Hutchins, whose claim bordered Porter's western edge. Sometimes people can't make it work. That's not Porter's fault. You're right, Eliza said smoothly. Failure is common in frontier ranching. But when failure clusters around one buyer, when it follows predictable patterns of rustling, fire, and market manipulation, it stops being coincidence and starts being strategy. She laid out the evidence methodically, drawing connections between events and acquisitions, showing price patterns that revealed systematic market depression followed by opportunistic buying. The room grew quieter as she spoke, skepticism giving way to unwilling recognition. Porter's been playing a long game, she concluded, weakening you individually, acquiring your land piece by piece, consolidating control over water and grazing rights. Alone, each of you is vulnerable. Together, you have leverage he can't easily overcome. What kind of leverage? The question came from a lean rancher named Douglas, whose sun-damaged face showed every one of his hard-won years. Information sharing, coordinated response to rustling, collective bargaining when selling cattle, mutual aid during crises. Eliza met his eyes squarely. Porter counts on your independence, on your reluctance to ask for help or offer it. He's weaponized the very qualities that brought you out here. You're talking about forming an association, Hutchins said. That takes organization, leadership. Someone has to coordinate. I'm proposing exactly that. A cattlemen's association with clear rules and shared responsibilities. Information flows between members. When one ranch faces trouble, others provide backup. When it's time to sell, you negotiate collectively for better prices. And who leads this association? Douglas asked. You? The challenge in his voice was clear. Caleb saw Eliza's jaw tighten fractionally, the only sign of frustration she allowed to show. I'm proposing the structure, she said. Leadership should come from someone you all trust, someone with a proven stake in this territory's future. Your husband, you mean? If you'll have him, or Eric Johansson, or someone else you choose, the structure matters more than the person. The men looked at each other, an unspoken conversation happening in glances and shifted weight. Finally, Eric spoke up. I've worked with Caleb for 6 years. He's fair and he's honest. I'd trust him to coordinate. He looked around the room. But the real question is whether you're all willing to set aside your pride long enough to admit we need each other. Because Mrs. Warren's right, alone, we're targets. Together, we're a lot harder to pick off. The debate that followed was heated but productive. Some men resisted the idea of collective action on principle, arguing that they'd come west to escape exactly this kind of organized dependency. Others saw the practical benefits immediately. In the end, 11 of the 15 ranchers agreed to form the Iron Creek Cattlemen's Association with Caleb as coordinator and Eric as his second. As the meeting broke up and men filed out into the November night, Douglas approached Eliza. His expression was difficult to read in the lamplight. That was impressive, Mrs. Warren, he said. The analysis, the presentation. Your husband's lucky to have a wife with brains. My husband's lucky to have a wife who's useful, Eliza corrected, just as I'm lucky to have a husband who values usefulness over decoration. Douglas laughed, surprised and genuine. Fair point. Porter's not going to like this association idea. No, Eliza agreed. He's not. Which is why it matters that you all stick together when he pushes back, and he will push back. Then we'll be ready. Douglas tipped his hat to her. Good evening, ma'am. Warren, you've got yourself a formidable partner. When they were finally alone in the wagon heading home, Eliza let out a long breath and sagged against the seat. Well, she said, that went better than I expected. You were remarkable. Caleb kept his eyes on the dark road ahead. The way you presented the evidence handled their skepticism. You made them see what they didn't want to see. Some of them still don't want to see it. Hutchins will be a problem. He doesn't like taking direction, especially not from a woman. Hutchins doesn't like taking direction from anyone, but Douglas will keep him in line. Caleb glanced at her. You handled Douglas well. Didn't back down, didn't apologize for being competent. Should I have apologized? Some women would have, made themselves smaller to make him comfortable. Eliza's laugh was sharp. I spent 32 years making myself smaller. I'm done with that. She looked out at the desert landscape sliding past in shades of silver and shadow. Do you think it'll work, the association? If Porter gives us reason to test it, yes. Men out here understand action better than theory. Once they see the benefits of coordination, they'll commit. And if Porter escalates instead of backing down, Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Then we escalate with him, together. Porter's response came sooner than expected. 3 days after the association meeting, 2 of Douglas's horses were found dead in their pasture, poisoned by contaminated water. A week later, rustlers hit the Johansson ranch and made off with 20 head before Eric could organize pursuit. And then, on a cold December morning, Caleb found fresh survey markers on his southern boundary, markers that placed his fence line 30 yards north of where it should be. He was examining the markers when Eliza rode up, her breath steaming in the frigid air. New boundaries? She asked. According to these, yes. According to my legal claim and 6 years of established use, no. He yanked one of the markers from the frozen ground. Porter's claiming I built my fence on his land. Can he do that? He can try. Land disputes out here usually come down to who was here first and who can prove it. I've got my original claim documents, but if Porter's filed a counterclaim with the territorial office, Caleb felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. This is exactly what he did to the Michaels Ranch 2 years ago. Created a boundary dispute, dragged it through the territorial courts, bankrupted them with legal fees while their land sat unworked. Eliza dismounted and walked the fence line, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. How much land is he claiming? Near 40 acres. Most of it rocky and useless, but it includes access to the southern spring. The spring that provided supplemental water during dry months, that made the difference between surviving drought and losing cattle. Without that spring, the ranch can't support 200 head. Then we don't let him take it. Eliza's voice was flat, final. We have the association now. We use it. Within 2 days, Caleb had called an emergency meeting of the association. The ranchers gathered at his ranch this time, standing in the yard with rifles in their hands and anger in their faces. Porter's escalation had made the threat real and immediate. He's testing us, Eric said, studying the survey markers Caleb had pulled up. Seeing if we'll actually stand together or if it was all talk. Then we show him it wasn't talk, Douglas said. What do you need, Warren? What Caleb needed was documentation, witnesses, and a show of force that made Porter reconsider legal harassment. The association provided all three. Eric and 2 others rode to the territorial office in Prescott with copies of Caleb's original claim documents and sworn statements from neighboring ranchers confirming the established boundary. Douglas and 3 more took shifts watching the disputed land, making sure Porter's men didn't try to build on it while the legal challenge was pending. The rest coordinated their cattle sales to pressure the buyers. Porter usually manipulated, proving they could indeed negotiate better prices collectively. It was working. Caleb could feel the shift, see it in the way Porter's men backed off when they encountered association members, hear it in the nervous reports Fletcher passed along about Porter's angry visits to the territorial office. They were no longer isolated targets. They were organized resistance. But organization came with a price. The coordination required constant communication, dispute resolution, decision-making that affected everyone. Caleb found himself spending hours each week riding between ranches, mediating disagreements, gathering information, making judgment calls that impacted families beyond his own. It was exhausting work that pulled him away from his own ranch at the worst possible time. Because winter was coming hard and early. December brought storms that dumped snow across the high country and sent temperatures plunging. Caleb worked brutal hours trying to keep ahead of the weather, moving cattle to sheltered valleys, reinforcing structures, stockpiling feed and firewood. And through it all, Eliza worked beside him without complaint, her Boston upbringing no protection against the harsh reality of an Arizona winter. They were bringing the last of the cattle down from the high pasture when the worst storm yet rolled in. Caleb saw it coming, felt the pressure change in his bones, but they were still 3 miles from the ranch when the snow started falling in thick, blinding sheets. "We need to get to the canyon," he shouted over the rising wind. "There's an overhang we can shelter under." They pushed the cattle hard, racing the storm to marginal safety. The canyon overhang was barely large enough for the animals and provided no real warmth, but it blocked the worst of the wind. Caleb and Eliza huddled against the rock face with their horses, sharing body heat as the temperature dropped and the world disappeared behind walls of white. "How long will it last?" Eliza asked, her lips already blue with cold despite the scarf wrapped around her face. "Hours. Maybe into tomorrow." Caleb pulled her closer, trying to share what warmth he had. "We should have turned back sooner. I pushed too hard." "We both did. We needed these cattle down." Her teeth chattered despite her steady voice. "We'll survive this." But as the hours passed and the cold deepened, survival stopped being certain and started being a question they fought to answer. Caleb felt his thoughts slow, his body wanting to shut down and conserve what little heat remained. Beside him, Eliza had gone quiet, her breathing shallow. "Eliza!" He shook her, fear cutting through his own exhaustion. "Stay awake, talk to me." "So tired," she murmured. "Just want to sleep." "No sleeping. That's how people die out here." He forced her to move, to stand up and stamp her feet despite the screaming protest of frozen muscles. "Tell me about Boston, about your family, anything. Just keep talking." She talked, her words slurred with cold but persistent, about her father's farm before the debt consumed it, about her mother's garden that grew roses no matter how harsh the winter, about her brother who chose security over loyalty and the marriage proposal that had been the final insult to her intelligence. She talked until her voice gave out, and then Caleb talked, telling her about Missouri and Sarah Hendricks and the 6 years he'd spent alone convincing himself he preferred it that way. "Don't prefer it," he said through numb lips. "Thought I did. Was lying to myself." "About what?" "About needing someone. About what that makes me." The words came easier in the storm's isolation, in the darkness where he couldn't see her face. Thought needing meant weakness. Thought I had to stand alone or I wasn't really standing. And now? Now I think I was afraid. Easier to be alone than to risk trusting someone who might leave. Eliza's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers frozen but her grip strong. I'm not leaving, Caleb. Storm or no storm. Porter or no porter. I chose this. I chose you. You chose a legal arrangement. I chose partnership with a man who treats me like an equal instead of an ornament, who values my mind instead of tolerating it, who stands with me instead of in front of me. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's worth fighting for. Worth freezing for, apparently. The storm finally broke near dawn, the wind dying to reveal a landscape transformed by snow. Caleb and Eliza stumbled out from the overhang, their bodies screaming with cold and exhaustion, but alive. The cattle had survived, huddled together for warmth. The horses were frost-covered but sound. They made it back to the ranch as the sun broke over the mountains, turning the snow to blinding white and gold. Caleb got Eliza into the house first, started a fire in the stove with shaking hands, heated water for coffee and soup. She sat wrapped in blankets, her face pale, but her eyes clear. That was close, she said. Too close. Caleb handed her coffee, watched her wrap both hands around the cup for warmth. I nearly got you killed. We nearly got us killed. Partnership, remember? Shared decisions, shared consequences. She sipped the coffee, grimaced at the heat but kept drinking. I don't regret it, Caleb. Even if we died out there, I wouldn't have regretted choosing this life over the one I left behind. He sat across from her, his own exhaustion pulling at him like weights. You should have had better choices, better options than freezing to death in Arizona. I had plenty of options. They were just all variations of slow suffocation. She met his eyes over the rim of her cup. This life is hard, brutal sometimes, but it's real, and it's mine, ours. That matters more than comfort. Caleb wanted to argue, to tell her she deserved comfort and safety and all the things he couldn't provide, but the words stuck in his throat because he knew she'd reject them. Eliza hadn't come west for rescue or comfort. She'd come for autonomy, for partnership, for the chance to build something on her own terms. And somehow, impossibly, they were building it, together. The near-death experience in the storm marked a shift between them. The walls they'd both maintained, necessary boundaries between business partners sharing space, began to thin. They still kept separate rooms, still maintained the practical arrangement they'd agreed to. But conversation came easier now, laughter broke through more often, and the silences between them felt comfortable rather than careful. Eliza started joining Caleb in the barn during evening chores, not because she needed to, but because she wanted the company. They worked side by side, talking about everything and nothing, the rhythm of shared labor creating space for honesty neither had expected. Tell me about Sarah, Eliza said one evening as they brushed down the horses. Caleb's hand stilled on the curry comb. Why? Because she's part of why you're so careful with trust. I'd like to understand. He resumed brushing, using the repetitive motion to organize his thoughts. She was pretty and young and said all the right things about adventure and building a life together. I believed her because I wanted to, proposed before I left for Arizona, planned to send for her once I had the land claim established. What happened? Her father happened, offered her to Daniel Pritchard, who had money and status and a future that didn't involve the frontier. She chose him without a conversation, sent me a letter explaining why comfort mattered more than promises. He moved to the gelding's other side. Taught me that love's just conditional acceptance. Soon as conditions change, the love evaporates. That's not love, Eliza said quietly. That's transaction dressed up in prettier words. Isn't that what we have? Transaction? We started with transaction, but I don't think that's what this is anymore. She set down her brush and came around to face him. Do you? Caleb met her eyes and felt something in his chest shift, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. No, he admitted. I don't think it is. Then what is it? He didn't have an answer, or rather, he had an answer he wasn't ready to speak out loud, wasn't sure he had the right to claim. Because what was growing between them felt like more than partnership, more than friendship, more even than the respect and trust they'd built. It felt like the thing he'd sworn he'd never risk again. It felt like love. Before Caleb could find the words to answer Eliza's question, a rider came hard into the yard, his horse lathered despite the cold. It was one of Douglas's ranch hands, a young man named Pete, whose face was tight with urgency. "Mr. Warren! Mrs. Warren!" he gasped, sliding from his saddle. "Mr. Douglas sent me. There's trouble at the Hutchins place. Bad trouble." Caleb was already moving toward his own horse. "What kind of trouble?" "Fire. Barn went up around midnight. Mr. Hutchins got his horses out, but he lost all his winter feed, his tack, everything." Pete's voice shook. "And there's tracks, Mr. Warren. Boot prints in the snow leading away from where the fire started. This was an accident." Eliza appeared beside Caleb with his rifle and coat. "How's Hutchins?" "Alive but barely holding together. His wife's beside herself and the kids are scared. Mr. Douglas is there now with some of the others, but he said we need everyone. Need to show Porter this won't stand." They rode out within minutes, joining a stream of ranchers converging on the Hutchins property. The scene that greeted them was devastation rendered in ash and smoke. The barn was a skeletal ruin, still smoldering despite the snow. Hutchins stood in the wreckage with his shoulders bowed, looking 10 years older than he had at the association meeting. His wife Sarah sat on the porch steps with their 3 children huddled against her, all of them wrapped in blankets in shock. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5, her face streaked with tears and soot. Eliza went straight to them while Caleb joined the men examining the burn site. Douglas pointed to the tracks Pete had mentioned, clear prints in the snow leading from the barn's western corner toward Porter's land. 2 men, maybe 3, Douglas said. They poured accelerant along the base, lit it, and ran. Didn't even try to hide their trail. "Because they don't think we'll do anything about it," Eric said grimly. "Or because they want us to know exactly who's responsible." Hutchins finally spoke, his voice raw from smoke and rage. "I argued against the association, said we didn't need collective action, that I could handle my own problems." He looked at the ruins of his livelihood. "I was wrong. Porter's sending a message, and it's meant for all of us." "Then we send one back," Caleb said. "Together." Over the next hours, the association proved its worth in ways that transcended strategy and politics. The ranchers brought supplies, feed from their own limited stores, tools, lumber, blankets for the family. They organized shifts to guard the property through the nights ahead. They documented the fire site with photographs and written statements, building evidence even though everyone knew the territorial law was too distant and too indifferent to act on it. And Eliza organized the women. She rode to each ranch personally, gathering the wives and daughters who'd been excluded from the association meetings, but whose support was essential for what came next. They arrived at the Hutchins place with food, clothing, medical supplies, and the kind of practical competence that turned crisis into manageable disaster. Caleb watched his wife move through the chaos with quiet authority, directing resources, comforting children, and sitting with Sarah Hutchins while the woman wept for everything she'd lost. This was a side of Eliza he hadn't seen before. Not the sharp analyst who'd organized the ranchers, not the determined partner who'd faced down rustlers, but something softer. Maternal, almost, though the word didn't quite fit her angular strength. "Your wife's something," Douglas said, following Caleb's gaze. "Most Eastern women would have fallen apart facing this." "Eliza's not most women." "No, she's not. You're fortunate, Warren. Partnership like that is rare." Fortunate. The word settled over Caleb with unexpected weight. He'd married Eliza out of legal desperation, viewing her as a solution to an impossible problem. But standing in the ruins of Hutchins' barn, watching her transform chaos into order through sheer force of competence and compassion, he realized Douglas was right. He was fortunate beyond anything he'd earned or deserved. They stayed at the Hutchins place until evening, helping clear debris and make plans for rebuilding. The association members pledged labor and materials, turning what should have been a crushing loss into a shared burden. By the time Caleb and Eliza rode home through the gathering dark, exhaustion sat heavy on both of them. "Will they recover?" Eliza asked. "With help, yes. The association can provide feed to get their cattle through winter. Come spring, we'll raise a new barn together." Caleb looked at her profile against the last light. What you did today, organizing the women, that mattered as much as anything the men did. They needed practical help, not just strategic planning, and Sarah needed to know she wasn't alone. Eliza's voice was quiet. I understand what it's like to lose everything because of someone else's greed. No woman should have to face that without support. Is that what happened to your mother? In a slower way, yes. The debt took years to consume us, but it was just as deliberate, just as designed. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. I watched it break her piece by piece until there was nothing left but exhaustion and early death. I swore I'd never be that helpless. You're not. You're the furthest thing from helpless I've ever known. She turned to look at him then, her gray eyes catching the last of the twilight. Neither are you, Caleb, but we're both learning we don't have to carry everything alone. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the kind that felt like understanding rather than absence of words. When they reached the ranch, Caleb tended the horses while Eliza went to start dinner. The familiar division of labor, the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over 4 months of marriage that had begun as convenience and become something neither of them could quite name. But that night, after they'd eaten and cleaned up and sat together going over the association's accounts, Eliza looked up from the ledger with an expression Caleb couldn't read. The fire changes things, she said. Porter's escalated beyond property disputes and legal harassment. He's willing to destroy livelihoods, risk lives. That level of aggression won't stop unless we make it stop. I know. So what do? We can guard against more fires, coordinate response to rustling, support each other through crises. But that's all defensive. Eventually, we need to go on offense. Caleb had been thinking the same thing, but hadn't wanted to voice it because offense meant confrontation. And confrontation out here meant violence. What kind of offense? The kind that hits Porter where he's vulnerable. His reputation, his business relationships, his political connections. Eliza pulled out a separate set of notes she'd been compiling. I've been documenting everything, the pattern of acquisitions, the market manipulation, the escalating harassment. If we can get this information to the territorial governor, to newspapers in Prescott and Phoenix, we can make Porter's tactics public knowledge. Public knowledge doesn't matter if no one cares. It matters to investors, to banks, to the Eastern interests that are funding territorial development. She met his eyes. Porter's built his empire on the assumption that no one's paying attention to what happens in remote regions like this. If we make them pay attention, we make him vulnerable. It was a good strategy, smart and surgical, but it required resources they didn't have, connections to newspapers and territorial officials, money to travel and make the case, time away from ranches that couldn't afford to be neglected. It would take months, Caleb said, and there's no guarantee it would work. No guarantee, Eliza agreed, but what's the alternative? We keep playing defense while Porter picks us off one by one? The fire proved he's willing to escalate. Next time, it might not be a barn. It might be a house with a family sleeping inside. The thought sent ice down Caleb's spine. We'd need to be careful. Porter has connections too, and men who will act on his behalf without asking questions. Then we'll be careful, but we can't be so careful we're paralyzed. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip warm and certain. I didn't come west to hide, Caleb, and I don't think you spent 6 years building this ranch just to let someone steal it through intimidation. She was right. Caleb knew she was right, but admitting it meant accepting that the careful peace they'd built over the past months was temporary, that conflict was coming whether they wanted it or not. We'll need to talk to the other ranchers, he said finally. Make sure they're willing to support this. If we're going public with accusations against Porter, we need unified testimony. I'll draft a proposal. We can present it at the next association meeting. But before they could organize that meeting, Porter made his next move. And this time, he came for Caleb directly. It was a week after the Hutchins fire, a cold January morning when frost turned the landscape to silver and white. Caleb was checking fence line in the eastern pasture when he saw the riders, 6 men moving with purpose toward the ranch house. He recognized Porter's sorrel mare in the lead and felt his stomach drop. Eliza was alone at the house. He rode hard, pushing his gelding faster than was safe on the frozen ground, rifle already in his hand. He reached the yard just as Porter and his men surrounded the porch where Eliza stood with a shotgun braced against her shoulder. "Mrs. Warren," Porter was saying, his voice carrying false concern, "no need for weapons. We're just here to talk." "Then talk from there," Eliza said, her voice steady despite being outnumbered 6-1. "You don't need to be on my porch to have a conversation." Caleb dismounted and moved to stand beside his wife, his rifle pointed deliberately at Porter. "You heard her. State your business from where you are." Porter's smile was thin and cold. "I'm here as a courtesy, Warren. Thought you should know that I've filed a formal complaint with the territorial office regarding your illegal fencing on my property. I've also petitioned for a survey to establish the correct boundaries. The boundaries are already established, have been for 6 years. According to your claim, yes, but I've discovered documentation that suggests the original survey was flawed. My land extends farther north than previously recognized." Porter pulled papers from his coat. "I have deeds, Warren, legal proof that you've been grazing cattle on my property without permission." "Those are forgeries," Eliza said flatly, "and everyone knows it." Porter's eyes went cold. "Careful, Mrs. Warren. Accusing a man of forgery is serious. You might find yourself in legal trouble if you can't prove such claims." "I can prove them," she said. "Just like I can prove you've been systematically driving down cattle prices, orchestrating rustling operations, and burning down barns when property owners won't sell to you." The air in the yard went deadly still. Porter's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. Caleb raised his rifle fractionally, enough to make his intentions clear. "Those are wild accusations," Porter said, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "The ravings of an Eastern woman who doesn't understand frontier business. I understand theft and arson just fine. Territory of origin doesn't change what those words mean." Porter's face flushed with anger. "You're making enemies you can't afford, Mrs. Warren. Both of you are. I came here to offer one final chance to sell before the legal proceedings begin. Walk away now, take a fair price, and avoid the courts." "Define fair," Caleb said. "10,000 for the land, stock, and improvements." The number was so insultingly low that Caleb almost laughed. The ranch was easily worth 3 times that, and Porter knew it. This wasn't a good faith offer. It was designed to provoke, to demonstrate Porter's contempt for their intelligence. "No," Caleb said simply. "No?" Porter's eyebrows rose. "You're refusing $10,000 to avoid years of legal battles you'll inevitably lose?" "I'm refusing to be robbed with paperwork instead of guns. Same theft, different method." "Then you're a fool." Porter gathered his reins. "The survey team arrives next week. They'll establish the real boundaries, and when they do, you'll find yourself grazing cattle on my land. I'll have legal grounds to seize them. Every head on the disputed acres becomes mine." He rode off with his men, leaving Caleb and Eliza standing in the cold with the weight of new threats settling over them like snow. "He's moving faster than I expected," Eliza said, lowering the shotgun but keeping it ready. "He's worried. The association scared him, and your documentation scares him more. He's trying to force a resolution before we can organize effective resistance. Then we organize faster." She turned to face him. "I'll ride to Douglas and Eric today. Get an emergency meeting called. If Porter's bringing in a survey team, we need witnesses present to challenge their findings. That puts you on the road alone." "I can handle it." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to insist she stay where he could protect her, but he'd learned over the past 4 months that Eliza's competence wasn't something to protect. It was something to trust. And right now they needed her skills as much as his. "Take the Winchester," he said. "And if you see anyone from Porter's crew, you ride past without engaging. Get the message delivered, nothing more." "I know how to stay safe, Caleb. I know you do. But let me worry anyway. That's what husbands do." Something shifted in her expression, softened. "Is that what you are? My husband? Or are we still just business partners sharing space?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty neither of them had quite voiced before. Caleb looked at this woman who'd arrived 4 months ago as a legal solution and had become the center of everything that mattered in his life, who stood beside him against threats that would have sent most people running, who'd reorganized his entire world and made him realize how empty it had been before she filled it. "I don't know what we are," he said finally. "I know what we started as, and I know what I want us to become, but I don't know if you want the same thing." "What do you want us to become?" "Partners. Not just in business, but in everything, husband and wife in truth, not just on paper. The words felt risky, exposed, like stepping onto ice that might not hold. I want what we've been building to be real, Eliza. I want to share more than work and space. I want— Me too, she interrupted, her voice rough with emotion. I want that too. I have for weeks, maybe longer. But I didn't know if you felt the same, if you'd ever want more than the arrangement we agreed to. I want more. I want everything. Caleb reached for her hand, felt her fingers lace with his. But only if you do. I won't push for something you don't want. I want it. She stepped closer, her gray eyes bright with something that might have been tears or hope, or both. I want a real marriage with you, Caleb. I want partnership and trust and whatever comes after that. I want— He kissed her before she could finish, pulling her close with the rifle still in one hand and her shotgun pressed between them. It was awkward and imperfect, and felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. She kissed him back with equal urgency, her free hand fisting in his coat, 4 months of carefully maintained distance collapsing in the space of a heartbeat. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eliza laughed shakily. That's not how I imagined this conversation going. How did you imagine it? I don't know. More words, maybe. Less immediate danger. But she was smiling, and it transformed her angular face into something radiant. Though I suppose immediate danger is our natural state now. Seems to be. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, allowing himself a moment of peace before the next crisis demanded attention. We should probably deal with Porter's survey team before we figure out the rest of this. Probably. But Caleb? She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. After we deal with Porter, after we secure the ranch and the association and everything else, I want time. Time to figure out what we are to each other without legal threats and fires and rustlers. I want that too. Then let's finish this fight so we can have it. The association meeting that night was tense and urgent. 14 ranchers crowded into Caleb's house, their faces grim as Eliza laid out Porter's latest move. The survey is designed to legitimize land theft, she explained, pointing to the map where she'd marked the disputed boundaries. If Porter's team establishes new lines that favor his claims, he'll have legal cover to seize cattle, file trespass charges, and ultimately force sales through court action. Can he actually do that? Hutchins asked. Change boundaries 6 years after the original survey? In the territory, yes. Land law is murky, and whoever has the best documentation usually wins. Porter's banking on his forged deeds being accepted as legitimate because challenging them requires resources most of us don't have. Douglas leaned forward. So what's our countermove? We ensure the survey isn't conducted in isolation. We have our own surveyor present, preferably someone with territorial credentials who can challenge Porter's findings on the spot. We document everything with photographs and written statements, and we make sure representatives from every ranch in this association attend as witnesses. That's a lot of bodies to coordinate, Eric said, and a lot of time away from our own work. It's also our best chance of preventing Porter from stealing Warren's land and using it as a precedent to come after the rest of us. Eliza's voice was firm. If we let him win here, we've already lost. The vote was unanimous. The association would mount a full response to Porter's survey, showing unified resistance to his tactics. They'd hire their own surveyor, gather documentation, and turn what Porter intended as a simple land grab into a public confrontation he couldn't control. Over the next week, preparations consumed every waking hour. Eliza coordinated with the Territorial Surveyor's Office, finding an independent expert willing to review the competing claims. Caleb worked with the other ranchers to gather historical evidence, old maps, photographs, sworn statements from longtime residents who could testify to the established boundaries. They prepared for confrontation with the thoroughness of people who understood this might be their last chance to stop Porter's advance. The morning the survey team arrived, 23 people stood waiting on the disputed land. The association ranchers, their wives, the independent surveyor Eliza had hired, and even Fletcher from the post office who'd come to document the proceedings. Porter clearly hadn't expected an audience. His surveyor, a nervous man named Keller, looked distinctly uncomfortable facing such organized resistance. This is highly irregular, Porter said, his sorrel mare dancing beneath him. Land surveys don't require spectators. Territorial law says any interested party can observe official surveys, Eliza replied, reading from the statute she'd researched. Since this survey affects boundary determinations for multiple properties, I'd say we're all interested parties. Porter's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the law. Fine. Let them watch. Won't change the results. But it did change the results. With witnesses present and an independent expert challenging every measurement, Keller couldn't simply validate Porter's forged deeds. The survey took 3 days instead of 1, every disputed foot of land examined and re-examined until the truth became impossible to deny. The original boundaries stood. Caleb's fence was exactly where it should be, and Porter's claims were exposed as fraudulent. This isn't over, Porter said on the third evening, his face mottled with rage. I have other options. Legal recourse you can't block with witnesses and amateur surveying. Then pursue them, Caleb said quietly. Take it to the territorial courts. File your complaints and produce your evidence. We'll be ready. Porter rode off, but the victory felt hollow. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over, and everyone standing on that disputed land knew it. That night, alone in their house with the association members dispersed back to their own ranches, Caleb and Eliza sat together in exhausted silence. The fire in the stove crackled softly, the only sound besides the wind outside. He'll come back harder, Eliza said finally. We embarrassed him publicly. Men like Porter don't forgive that. I know. Caleb reached for her hand, felt her fingers intertwine with his. But we'll be ready, together. Together, she agreed. And then, after a pause heavy with meaning, I think I'd like to move my things into your room, if that's all right. Caleb's breath caught. You're sure? I'm sure. She turned to face him, her gray eyes steady. We're married, Caleb. We've been fighting side by side for months. I trust you with my life and my future. I think I can trust you with my heart, too. You can, he promised. I'll guard it as carefully as I guard the ranch, maybe more carefully. She smiled, soft and genuine. Then help me move my books. Fair warning, there are a lot of them. They moved her belongings together, making trips between the 2 rooms that had marked the boundaries of their careful distance. It felt significant, this physical merging of spaces, like a declaration that their marriage was real in all the ways that mattered. Later, lying in the darkness with Eliza curled against his side, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe, or certainty. They still faced threats, still had battles to fight, but they'd face them together now, not as business partners or reluctant spouses, but as husband and wife in truth. Caleb? Eliza's voice was soft in the darkness. Yes? I love you. I should have said it earlier, but I'm saying it now. I love you. The words landed like grace, unexpected and transforming. I love you too, he said, and felt the truth of it in every fiber of his being. I think I have for a while now. Just took me time to recognize it. We're both slow learners when it comes to trust. But we get there eventually. She laughed quietly. Yes, we do. Outside, the wind howled across the desert, carrying the promise of more storms ahead. But inside, wrapped in warmth and the quiet certainty of love earned through shared struggle, Caleb felt ready for whatever came next. They'd built something strong together, something worth defending, and defend it they would. The weeks following their declaration of love brought a sweetness to the ranch that Caleb had never imagined possible. Despite the threat of Porter still looming like storm clouds on the horizon, he woke each morning beside Eliza and felt something close to joy. They worked together with an ease that came from genuine partnership, their conversations ranging from cattle management to shared dreams about the ranch's future. At night, they sat by the fire and planned not just for survival, but for growth, for legacy, for the life they were building together. But sweetness couldn't protect them from what was coming. The first sign of Porter's new strategy arrived in late January, delivered by a territorial marshal who rode up to the ranch with official papers and an apologetic expression. Mr. Warren, Mrs. Warren, Marshal Hayes said, accepting the coffee Eliza offered but looking uncomfortable. I'm here on official business. Samuel Porter has filed charges of cattle theft and trespassing against you. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. Based on what evidence? Based on his claim that you've been grazing cattle on his property without permission. He's also alleging that some of his stock has been found in your herd, suggesting theft. Hayes pulled out the documents. You're required to appear before the territorial magistrate in Prescott in 3 weeks to answer these charges. Eliza took the papers before Caleb could, reading them with the focused attention she brought to everything involving legal language. These charges are fabricated. We have witnesses from the land survey who can testify that our boundaries are legally established. Ma'am, I'm not here to judge the merits of the case. I'm just serving the papers. Hayes looked genuinely uncomfortable. For what it's worth, I know Porter's reputation, but the law requires I deliver these, and it requires you to respond. After the marshal left, Eliza spread the papers across the table with controlled fury. This is retaliation for the survey. He lost that confrontation, so now he's trying to destroy us through the courts. Can he actually make these charges stick? Not if we present proper defense. But defending ourselves will cost money we don't have and time away from the ranch we can't afford. She looked up at Caleb, her gray eyes troubled. This is the strategy I warned about. Legal harassment designed to bankrupt us, even if we win. Then we don't play his game. We go on offense, like you suggested. Caleb moved to stand beside her, studying the false charges with rising anger. You said you could document his pattern of land theft and market manipulation. Can you turn that documentation into something the territorial authorities can't ignore? I can try. But it would mean traveling to Prescott, meeting with officials, possibly journalists, making a public case that could backfire if we can't prove everything we're claiming. We can prove it. Between your records and the association's testimony, we can show exactly what Porter's been doing. Caleb took her hand. I know it's risky, but what's the alternative? We show up to defend against false charges while he continues picking off other ranchers? Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through scenarios and risks. If we do this, we do it right. Full documentation, sworn statements from everyone Porter's victimized, physical evidence of arson and theft. We build a case so comprehensive that even territorial officials who'd prefer to ignore frontier disputes can't dismiss it. How long do we have? 3 weeks until the hearing. That gives us time to gather everything and present it not just as defense against his charges, but as countercharges of our own. They worked through the night, compiling evidence and planning strategy. By dawn, they had a framework. Eliza would coordinate with the association to gather testimony while Caleb worked with Eric to document recent incidents of theft and harassment. They'd present the information to the territorial governor's office before the hearing, forcing officials to consider Porter's pattern of criminal behavior when evaluating his charges against Caleb. It was aggressive, risky, and exactly the kind of fight Eliza had prepared for when she first analyzed Porter's tactics. But executing it meant splitting their focus between ranch work and legal preparation, leaving them vulnerable in ways that made Caleb deeply uneasy. His unease proved justified when, 2 days later, riders hit the Douglas Ranch in broad daylight. They drove off 30 head of cattle and set fire to a hay shed before Douglas and his sons could organize response. The attack was brazen, clearly designed to send a message. The association's resistance would be met with escalating violence. The emergency meeting that night was tense and divided. Some ranchers wanted to respond with force, to ride to Porter's ranch and take back what was stolen with guns if necessary. Others argued for restraint, for relying on legal processes and official channels. The debate grew heated, voices rising as fear and anger pushed men toward extreme positions. Caleb listened until the arguments started repeating themselves, then stood. The room quieted. Violence is what Porter wants, he said. He's baiting us into attacking him so he can claim self-defense and turn the territorial authorities against us. We respond with force. We lose everything we've built. So we just take the hits? Douglas demanded, his face flushed with rage. Let him burn our property and steal our stock while we file paperwork? No, we document every attack, gather evidence, and present it to the territorial governor along with the pattern of Porter's criminal behavior. Caleb looked around the room. Eliza's been building a legal case. It's comprehensive and damning. If we add these recent attacks to it, we can force the territorial authorities to act. And if they don't act, Hutchins asked, If they're too corrupt or too indifferent to care what Porter does out here, then we take it to the newspapers. Make it public enough that they can't ignore it without destroying their own credibility. Eliza's voice cut through the tension. But we try the legal route first. Not because it's certain to work, but because it's the only approach that doesn't end with some of you in graves and the rest of you fugitives. The stark truth of her words settled over the room. These were hard men who'd survived the frontier through strength and determination, but they weren't fools. They understood that open war with Porter would cost more than any of them could afford. "How long until you can present this evidence?" Eric asked. 2 weeks, Eliza said. "I need that long to compile everything properly and coordinate testimony. Can you hold on that long without retaliation?" The ranchers exchanged glances, silent conversations in the language of men who'd learned to communicate without words. Finally, Douglas nodded. 2 weeks. But if Porter hits anyone else before then, all bets are off. The next 2 weeks tested everyone's endurance. Eliza worked 18-hour days compiling documentation, conducting interviews, and transforming months of observation into legally precise evidence. Caleb split his time between helping her and coordinating with the association to prevent more attacks, organizing rotating guard schedules and rapid response teams. They barely slept. The ranch work suffered, corners cut, and maintenance deferred because there simply weren't enough hours to do everything. But the case Eliza was building was comprehensive enough to make the sacrifice worthwhile. She had documented 18 suspicious property acquisitions, 47 instances of cattle theft tied to Porter's operation, 3 arson cases with evidence pointing to his hired men, and a pattern of market manipulation spanning 5 years. It was damning. But it was also complex, technical, and required territorial officials to care about frontier ranchers enough to actually read and act on the evidence. 5 days before the hearing, Caleb found Eliza at the table surrounded by papers, her eyes red from exhaustion and her hand cramping from hours of writing. "You need to rest," he said gently. "I need to finish." But her voice cracked on the last word, exhaustion and stress finally breaking through her iron control. "If I don't get this right, if I miss something or fail to make the case clearly enough, people lose everything. The Hutchins family, Douglas, Eric, all of them. They're counting on me." Caleb pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, feeling her shake with the weight of responsibilities she'd taken on. "They're counting on us. And you've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. The case is strong, Eliza. It's thorough and well documented. If they don't act on it, that's their failure, not yours. But what if my best isn't enough? Then we try something else. We keep fighting." He pulled back to meet her eyes. "But right now, you need sleep. You can't finish this if you collapse from exhaustion." She wanted to argue, he could see it in the set of her jaw, but her body betrayed her with a yawn that proved his point. "A few hours," she conceded. "Then I need to review the testimony statements one more time." Those few hours stretched to 8 as exhaustion finally claimed her. Caleb stayed awake, reading through the documents she'd compiled and feeling awe at the sheer scope of work she'd accomplished. This wasn't just a legal defense. It was an indictment of everything Porter had built, a comprehensive dismantling of his operations that left no room for officials to claim ignorance. When Eliza woke, she found Caleb at the table with fresh coffee and a quiet determination in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said. "We present this to the governor's office first, before the hearing. Don't give Porter advance warning. Just walk in with the full case and force them to confront it. That's risky. If they refuse to see us or dismiss it out of hand, then we release it to every newspaper in the territory. Make it so public that ignoring it becomes politically impossible." He handed her the coffee. "You said we needed to go on offense. This is how we do it. Hit hard, hit fast, and make retreat impossible for either side." Eliza sipped her coffee, her strategic mind clearly working through the implications. "We'd need to coordinate with the association, have them ready to provide testimony if the governor's office wants verification. Eric's already organized that. Said to tell you that 12 ranchers are ready to travel to Prescott on 1 day's notice." 12? She smiled, tired but genuine. Porter probably thought the association would fall apart under pressure. Instead, we've gotten stronger. Because of you. Your strategy, your documentation, your refusal to accept that men like Porter just get away with theft and violence. Caleb took her hand. I know you're exhausted and scared this won't work, but whatever happens, you've already changed everything. These ranchers were isolated targets before you arrived. Now they're organized resistance. That matters, regardless of what the governor does. 3 days later, they rode into Prescott with saddlebags full of documentation and hearts full of cautious hope. The territorial capital was larger than Iron Creek, its streets crowded with people and commerce, and the machinery of government that seemed both impressive and remote. They checked into a modest hotel, reviewed their materials one final time, and in the morning walked into the governor's office with the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. The secretary tried to turn them away. The governor was busy, had no appointments available, couldn't be bothered with routine territorial disputes. But Eliza had anticipated resistance. She placed a single document on the secretary's desk, a summary of Porter's criminal operations with specific dates, locations, and financial figures that made ignoring it impossible. Tell Governor Murphy that we have evidence of systematic land fraud, arson, and theft affecting multiple counties, she said calmly. Tell him that if he doesn't see us today, this information goes to every newspaper in the territory tomorrow. And tell him that territorial officials who ignore documented criminal operations tend to find themselves unemployed after the next election. The threat was bold, possibly foolish, but it worked. 30 minutes later, they sat across from Governor Murphy himself, a florid man with shrewd eyes who listened to their presentation with growing interest. Eliza laid out the case with precision, walking Murphy through the documentation while Caleb provided context about frontier conditions and the impact of Porter's operations on legitimate ranchers. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, answering questions and providing supporting evidence until the scope of Porter's criminal enterprise became undeniable. When they finished, Murphy sat back in his chair and studied them with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "This is extensive work," he said finally, "the kind of documentation that took significant time and expertise to compile." "My wife is quite skilled at pattern recognition," Caleb said, "and quite determined when someone threatens what we've built." Murphy's mouth quirked in something that might have been amusement. "I can see that. Mr. Porter has been a significant contributor to territorial development projects. He has powerful friends who won't appreciate these accusations." Caleb felt his stomach drop, recognizing the political calculation behind Murphy's words. But Eliza didn't flinch. Then his powerful friends should have encouraged him to acquire land legally instead of through criminal operations, she said. "Because this evidence is going public regardless of what you do with it, Governor. The only question is whether territorial officials act proactively to address criminal behavior or whether they're exposed as complicit in it." The room went very quiet. Caleb held his breath, wondering if Eliza had just pushed too hard, threatened the wrong person. But Murphy surprised him by laughing, short and sharp. "You've got steel, Mrs. Warren. I appreciate that." He gathered the documents with careful precision. "I'll order an investigation. Can't promise what it'll find or how quickly, but I can promise it'll be thorough. In the meantime, I'm postponing the hearing on Porter's charges against you until the investigation concludes." It was more than Caleb had dared hope for. "Thank you, Governor." "Don't thank me yet. Porter will push back hard when he learns about this investigation. You've made a powerful enemy, and territorial protection only extends so far." Murphy met their eyes seriously. "Watch yourselves. Men like Porter don't accept defeat gracefully." They left the governor's office with official papers postponing the hearing and a promise of investigation that felt both like victory and like standing on the edge of a cliff. The walk back to their hotel passed in tense silence, both of them processing what they'd accomplished and what it might cost. That night, lying in their hotel room with the sounds of Prescott filtering through the window, Eliza turned to Caleb with her gray eyes troubled. "We've committed now," she said quietly. "There's no backing down, no peaceful resolution. Porter will come after us with everything he has." "I know." Caleb pulled her closer. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified. But also—" She paused, searching for words. "Also certain. For the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that's completely mine. Something I built with my own hands and mind. That's worth being afraid for." "We built it," Caleb corrected. "Together. And we'll defend it the same way." The investigation Murphy promised began within days of their meeting. Territorial marshals arrived in Iron Creek asking questions, examining property records, interviewing ranchers about their experiences with Porter. The association members provided testimony willingly, no longer isolated victims but coordinated witnesses building an overwhelming case. Porter's response was predictably aggressive. He hired lawyers, called in political favors, and attempted to discredit the investigation as territorial overreach. But the evidence was too extensive, the pattern too clear. Even officials who might have preferred to ignore frontier disputes couldn't dismiss the documentation Eliza had compiled. The territorial governor's investigation concluded in early March, with findings that vindicated everything Caleb and Eliza had claimed. Porter was charged with multiple counts of fraud, arson, and conspiracy to commit theft. His land acquisitions were placed under review, many of them ultimately reversed when the forged documentation was exposed. His political connections crumbled as former allies distanced themselves from the scandal. But Porter wasn't finished. Facing ruin and prosecution, he made one final desperate move. It came on a cold March evening when Caleb was checking fence line and Eliza was at the house preparing dinner. She heard the riders before she saw them, 3 men approaching fast with violence in their posture. She grabbed the Winchester and positioned herself in the doorway, her heart pounding but her hands steady. "Mrs. Warren." The lead rider was someone she didn't recognize, a hard-faced man with empty eyes. "Mr. Porter sent us with a message. Drop the charges and the testimony, or things get worse for you and your husband." "Tell Mr. Porter his threats don't work anymore," Eliza said, her voice calmer than she felt. "The investigation is concluded. The charges are filed. There's nothing to drop." "Then you've made a mistake." The man's hand moved toward his gun. Eliza raised the Winchester. "So have you. There are association members watching this ranch 24 hours a day. You fire that weapon and you'll have 15 armed ranchers here within minutes. Think carefully about whether delivering Porter's message is worth dying for." It was a bluff. The association guards were positioned at the eastern boundary, too far away to respond quickly. But the riders didn't know that. They exchanged glances, calculating odds and risks. The standoff broke when Caleb rode into the yard behind them, his rifle already aimed at the lead rider. "My wife gave you good advice," he said quietly. "I suggest you take it and ride out while you still can." The riders left, but their threat hung in the air like smoke. That night, Caleb and Eliza didn't sleep. They kept watch together, rifles ready, waiting for another attack that never came. Because Porter's hired men had recognized what Porter himself refused to accept, the fight was already lost. The trial happened in late April, held in Prescott with territorial judges presiding. Porter's lawyers tried every trick they knew, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rancher after rancher testified about theft and harassment. Property records exposed the fraudulent documentation. Even some of Porter's own former employees testified against him, men who'd participated in the criminal operations but chose cooperation over prosecution. Caleb and Eliza sat through every day of testimony, watching justice move with agonizing slowness but undeniable momentum. And when the verdict came, guilty on 17 counts, Eliza reached for Caleb's hand and held on tight. Porter was sentenced to prison and ordered to make restitution to the ranchers he'd defrauded. His land holdings were seized and redistributed, many of them returned to the families he'd forced out. His empire collapsed completely, leaving nothing behind but cautionary tales and grateful survivors. The ride back to Iron Creek took 2 days, but it felt like coming home to a different world. The threat that had shadowed them for months was gone. The ranch was truly theirs now, secured not just by legal documents, but by community support and hard-won justice. Spring turned to summer, and life on the ranch settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than desperate. The association continued meeting regularly, but now their discussions focused on cooperative opportunities rather than defensive strategies. They organized collective cattle sales that got better prices than any of them could achieve alone. They coordinated on infrastructure projects, building roads and wells that benefited multiple ranches. What had started as defensive necessity became genuine community. Eliza's role in the association's success was undeniable, and gradually the ranchers' wives began seeking her advice on everything from household management to market strategy. She organized gatherings that brought isolated families together, creating support networks that made frontier life less lonely. The The sharp-eyed woman who'd arrived from Boston as a mail-order bride became the backbone of Iron Creek's emerging community. One evening in late June, Caleb found her on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of amber and rose. He settled beside her, their shoulders touching in comfortable familiarity. "Tired?" he asked. "Satisfied," she corrected. "There's a difference." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was thinking about when I first arrived, how desperate we both were, how this marriage was just a legal solution to impossible problems. And now? Now it's everything. Partnership and love and purpose all tangled together in ways I never imagined possible." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes soft in the fading light. "I left Boston to escape a life I didn't want. But I found something here I didn't even know I needed." "What's that?" "Home. Not just a place, but the feeling of belonging somewhere completely, of building something that matters with someone who sees me as an equal partner." She took his hand. "Thank you for that, for trusting me enough to let me be useful instead of decorative." Caleb raised her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "Thank you for arriving when you did, for being exactly who you are instead of who someone thought you should be, for fighting beside me instead of behind me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun completed its descent and the first stars appeared. Around them, the ranch hummed with evening sounds, cattle settling for the night, horses moving in the corral, the wind carrying the scent of sage and possibility. In September, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with terror, both of them acutely aware of the risks of frontier childbirth. But the association women rallied around her with the same fierce competence they'd shown in every crisis, sharing knowledge and resources and support. When their daughter was born in early April, healthy and loud and perfect, she was welcomed by a community that had learned the value of standing together. They named her Sarah, after Hutchins' wife, who'd shown such strength after the barn fire. And as Caleb held his daughter for the first time, feeling the weight of this tiny life that depended on him completely, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From desperate bachelor facing impossible ultimatums to husband and father surrounded by family and community. The ranch thrived over the following years. With Porter's holdings redistributed and the association coordinating operations, Iron Creek became known as one of the territory's success stories. When Arizona achieved statehood, the Cattlemen's Association became an official organization with political influence, and Eliza served as its first secretary, her documentation and strategic skills shaping territorial policy. More children came, 2 sons who inherited their mother's sharp mind and their father's quiet strength. The small ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, additions built with help from association members who remembered how Caleb and Eliza had fought for all of them. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb and Eliza stood together in the yard watching their children play near the creek. The ranch had grown substantially, the herd now numbering over 400 head. The house was comfortable without being ostentatious. The community they'd helped build surrounded them with friendship and support. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Leaving Boston for this?" Eliza laughed, the sound rich with genuine joy. "Every day I wake up grateful that telegram found me when it did, that I was brave enough or desperate enough to answer it." She took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "I left Boston because I had to, but I stayed here because I wanted to. Because this life, this partnership, this family, it's everything I was looking for without knowing what I was searching for." "I understand that feeling." Caleb pulled her close, watching their daughter teach the boys to skip stones on the creek. "I thought I wanted to be alone. Thought independence meant never needing anyone. But you taught me that real strength is being strong enough to let someone stand beside you." "We taught each other," Eliza corrected. "That's what partnership means." As the sun set over Iron Creek Ranch, painting the landscape in the colors of home and promise, Caleb reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them here. From a desperate 30-day deadline to a decade of building something that would outlast them both. From strangers bound by legal necessity to partners bound by love and shared purpose. The ultimatum that had seemed like disaster had become the foundation of everything good in his life. The woman who'd arrived as a solution had become his salvation. and the marriage that began with fear and calculation had transformed into devotion that deepened with every passing year. They'd fought for this life against impossible odds. They'd stood together when standing alone would have meant defeat. They'd built not just a ranch, but a legacy of partnership, of community, of love that transcended the circumstances that brought it into being. And standing in the twilight with Eliza's hand in his and their children's laughter filling the air, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that every struggle had been worth it. Every risk, every fight, every moment of doubt, all of it had led to this perfect evening on land they'd defended together, surrounded by family they'd created and community they'd helped build. Iron Creek Ranch would endure for generations, but more importantly, so would the story of how two desperate strangers chose partnership over isolation, trust over fear, and love over the safety of guarded hearts. It was a legacy worth more than land or cattle or any material wealth. It was a legacy of choosing each other every single day and building something beautiful from the broken pieces they'd started with. And in the end, that was everything.